Welcome everyone to this new webinar by BRISMES Outreach and Pedagogy Committee. And today we are going to be discussing Dr. Rahaf Aldoughli's book. I would say anticipated book, Romanticizing Masculinity in Baathist Syria. And I am very, actually privileged and excited to be here. My name is Sabiha Alouche. Um, I am the chair of the BRISMES Outreach and Pedagogy Committee. And um, I'm based at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, and I specialize in gender and sexuality in reference to the Middle East. I'm going to spend a few minutes just introducing you, maybe giving a background, I would say, to the book and what to expect about the conversation today. But I also want to introduce our speakers, Dr. Rahaf Aldoughli, who's a lecturer in Middle East and North African Studies at Lancaster University and senior editor at Cogent Social Sciences. Rahaf is a leading scholar in Middle Eastern studies, and her work has been recognized with awards and grants from institutions such as Women in International Security, the Kroc Institute Fellowship, EXCEPT, and the Arab Center for Graduate Studies. Her research explores nationalism, sectarianism, and political attitudes in authoritarian contexts through an interdisciplinary lens. She is the author of Romancing Masculinity in Baathist Syria, Gender, Ideology, and Identity, and she's finalizing a forthcoming book on sectism. I think we can ask you later about how you conceptualize that with IB Tauris. She's also working on her third book, which examines Syrian armed groups and the motivations of fighters in the Syrian war. Rahav's expertise had been sought by international media, including Die Zeit, I hope I pronounced it correctly, the New York Times, NBC News, Al Jazeera English, TRT World, France 24, Truth, Enab Baladi, BBC News, and Channel 4. She's also authored commissioned reports for Chatham House, Foreign Affairs, New Lines Magazine, and the Middle East Institute. And through her research, Rahaf seeks to deepen the academic discourse on conflict dynamics, identity formation, and political behavior in the Middle East, with the broader aim of informing policy and peace-building efforts. Um, Amazing profile, and I'm even more excited now, to discuss the book with you. I mean, I say discuss, but I'm hoping it will be more like a conversation. And just to give the audience an idea, after introducing a little bit the background, speaking a little bit about the background to this conversation, Rahaf will introduce her book to us. She will give us a presentation, 20, 25 minutes. And then in the meantime, for the audience, please do not hesitate to include your questions if you have any. And we will take the remaining time to answer them. We're not necessarily bound by time. We don't have to fill the whole 90 minutes as such, and we can be flexible with that. So, like, well, not like many books, actually, I did read the book from cover to cover, although I must admit, I did skim over chapter three. Not because there's anything wrong with the chapter, it's just me. I was more interested, in the cultural productions and the songs, right, than the law and the constitution, etc. And so, as we prepare for this talk, I think we'll all agree that Syria could be described, right, as going through a transitional phase, right? This would be a conventional political talk. And I think I can guess rightly, right, when I say that, Rahaf, you are already in a race almost against all these new developments. You already had a very widely received article in Al Jumhuriya, I believe, and today also Merit, Middle East Report and Information Project, published also a new piece. And I mean, I'm going to guess both pieces do build on and follow from your book, and we of course want to hear more, right? And hopefully we will use this space for particularly for this purpose. And today's Marib's piece will also be featured in Marib's special issue, forthcoming special issue on gender. Well, issue on gender, it's not special. And I think. Yeah, I mean, I did prepare a longer introduction, but I really think we all want to hear more from Rahaf. I can always share my notes for later. So, Rahaf, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabiha. I'm so honored to be here with you and invited by BRISMES to talk about my book. Actually, and I will be honest with that. Like when I started writing this book, that was like my project 10 years ago, even more, from when I was in Syria. And when it was finally published, then the regime fell down, and I felt like, oh my God, so is the Baathist masculinity will stay in, or how it will evolve in under al-Sharia, or under a completely different actually political actors. Now, I would like first again to thank you for inviting me. Actually, and I want to emphasize that my book began as a personal and intellectual journey. Actually, it emerged from my own experience of growing up under the Baathist regime and grappling with its paradoxical narratives, particularly how it framed gender, nationhood, and belonging. In Syria, nationalism has always been more than a political allegiance. It's situated within emotional and gendered expectations. From childhood, for example, we were taught to love the nation as one might love a father or a husband, and to perform the love through slogans like, with blood and soul, we sacrifice ourselves for you, Hafiz al-Assad. So these were not only metaphors, they were demanded forms of emotional and bodily submissions to a patriarchal ideal. Actually, my book argues that Baathist nationalism in Syria developed from what I call a romantic masculinism, which is an ideology in which national belonging is fused with love, loyalty, and the glorifications of masculine sacrifice. The male body actually becomes both weapon and symbol, ready to die for the leader, the land, and the imagined community. And women, we were often excluded from the picture, relegated to symbols, objects of protections, or supporters of male heroism, but rarely treated as agents of the nation. I traced actually this ideology back to early Syrian national thinkers like Sati al-Husari, Michel Afla, and Zaki al-Arsouzi, who drew heavily on European Romanticism. So when I started writing this book, actually, it was at the beginning of the Syrian uprising in 2012, and it was a very kind of heightened moment for me, as I think I had an identity crisis, being in the UK and without like being able to go back to Syria, and the uprising started with the slogans, with very entrenched emotive slogans, like from the opposition and from the Baathist, also loyalists, like, we want to die for the nation, Damascus is the land of jasmine. There was so much emotionalized narratives about defending the nation or protecting the nation. And it took me actually that if I want to write my PhD, and this is kind of came from my PhD thesis at the beginning, and what does it mean to belong to Syria? What does it mean to belong to the nation? And why Syrians, even when they express their belonging to Syria, whether from the opposition or from the regime loyalists, they describe it in a very masculine and gendered sentiments. And then I started to read what defines your belonging or your national belongings. And it took me actually, and also because the Baathist nationalism Baathism has always been defined as secular. So the regime never defined itself or presented itself as a religious state, but more as they kind of established or a more of a homogenized narrative about Baathist secularism or secularism in Syria. Now, it came to me like the religious leaders or the religious institutions in Syria were co-opted, instrumentalized, but they did not represent the state. They are not the state. But however, the Baathist ideology, that's why while claiming itself to be secular, they used religion as a tool. But it didn't mean that white women has a secondary status in Syria, I couldn't interpret it to religion or to religious institutions because the state or the Baathist state defined itself or presented itself as secularism. Actually, that's why I started with ideology. So I traced this ideology back to early Syrian nationalist thinkers, such as I said, Michel Aflaq, Zaki al-Arsuzi, and Saleh al-Husari, who draw heavily on European Romanticism. So again, the book moves between, I started with these early ideological borrowings, the concept of belonging to Syria or the Syrian nationalism actually emanates from these Syrian thinkers who borrowed these ideological concepts from three European thinkers from the 19th century, like Herder, Fichte, and Ernest Renan. So at the heart, actually, of my argument is the claim that masculinity in Syria was not just socially constructed, it was a state project. They did not, so the Baathist regime did not simply draw on existing gender norms, it actively reshaped and institutionalized them through laws, education, and national performance, from songs and stages to school curriculum and military spectacles. And actually, this masculine ideal has deep historical roots. I trace it, as I said, I trace it to the writings of these Syrian thinkers who borrowed from the European ones. And actually, I think a key part of this book's contribution is tracing how early Syrian nationalist ideologues borrowed extensively from European Romanticism to construct their vision of the Syrian nation, and how these ideological borrowings became central to Baathist states building. So I focus in particular actually on in terms of to understand how this romantic masculinism became central to Baathist nationalism. I started to revisit the ideological genealogy. Now, for example, if I say that how the Syrian thinkers drew heavily from the 19th century European Romantic nationalism, we see that these Syrian thinkers embraced the idea of the nation as an organic, emotional unity, a people bound not by law, but by shared blood, language, memory, and sacrifice. But in adapting these ideas to the Arab world, they also gave them a distinct patriarchal form. For example, Herder's idea of a unique, Vosgist, like a cultural unity of the nation, a national spirit, which is a national spirit expressed through language, which has also resonated deeply with Arsuzi, who famously wrote, "Language is not only our expression, it's our soul, and the Arab soul is forged in struggle and in pride." Also, Fichte, for example, the German thinker, his vision of the ideal citizen as one who lives and dies for his people, which echoes very much Aflaq's speech, which is like the blood of the martyr is the ink with which the nation writes its future. For Husari, for example, also he describes emotional unity was both about destiny and duty. He declared, "Every Arab who speaks Arabic is an Arab, regardless of the different religious belief or sectarian identities they hold. He is an Arab whether he accepts this or not." This is according to Al-Husari. And this is very much also, I found these kind of, because Salta al-Husari, Michel Afle and Zeki al-Arsouzi, they studied in France, and they were very much influenced by Herder, Fichte, and Brennan. Now, these ideological inheritance actually laid the groundwork for the Baathist state's fusion of obedience with love, violence with virtue, and masculinity with national legitimacy. And it was not limited to elite political discourse. It was codified in law, rehearsed in classrooms, and etched into monuments, ensuring that romantic masculinism would become not just a symbol of power, but a condition of belonging. It was so how, if we ask the question, how these borrowings manifested in the modern nation states of Syria under the Baath regime. For example, in particular, the personal status law drawn from, for example, I would say the Baathist state presented itself as the liberator of women, granting voting rights as early as granting women's voting rights, supporting girls' education, and promoting female political participation. But these gains remained largely symbolic. In practice, the personal status law drawn from religious jurisprudence, but enforced through the state, continued to enshrine patriarchal control over marriage, inheritance, and guardianship. For example, also the state upheld sectarian legal codes, preventing interfaith marriages, and let the woman converted. The penal code also permitted rapists to escape punishment by marrying their victims, and the so-called honor crimes were treated with shocking leniency. These are not cultural remnants. They are legislative choices that reflect the regime's deep investment in a gendered hierarchy that privileges a particular kind of militarized and patriarchal masculinity. Now, but as women's struggle for more, like in terms of, for example, when we say this legal misogyny was constantly veiled in nationalist romanticism. In official rhetoric, the regime framed women's struggle for rights as inseparable from their patriotic duty. For example, Hafez al-Assad declared women's struggle for more rights is part of their national struggle. But as I argue in the book, this formulation traps women's rights within the framework of state-controlled loyalty. Women were allowed to be free only as their freedom did not challenge patriarchal authority or state ideology. For example, despite that the Baathist constitution itself was riddled with contradictions. For example, while Article 25 speaks of equality before the law, other states allow for unequal treatment based on gender, especially within the family and in the judiciary system. Now, after going through the constitution and the penal code, of course, these kind of the legislations in the Syrian law were also discussed in the books of Salta al-Husari, Zeki al-Arsouzi, and Michel Afle. So that you see that kind of, even with the new formation of Syria under Hafez al-Assad, these concepts were still has its trace within these early ideological writings of these three thinkers. Of course, Syrian nationalism or romantic masculinism and in the Syrian nationalist project, I would say, also moved into the cultural aspects. So we were also singing the nation. So one of the most powerful and yet overlooked instruments of Baathist ideology is the national song, actually. For example, in my book, I analyzed I think 22 national songs. These songs did not just echo in the background. They were core pedagogical tools shaping how Syrians understood love to the nation, loyalty, and sacrifice, and what actually it meant to belong anyway. As I show in the later chapters of the book, that the Baathist masculinist order did not collapse actually with the start of or the beginning of the uprising. In fact, it found a new life in the chaos of post-2011 Syria, but something fundamental shifted. So while Syrian or this masculinist ideology was enforced from above, we see that in fact that there is something that there is a fundamental shift in terms of how the gendered ideological order that once associated with the state became reproduced from below. So after 2011, we see that the revival of masculine nationalism no longer depended solely on government institutions. It was sustained by everyday Syrians, including opposition supporters and regime loyalists who drew on the emotional reservoir of Baathist training. For example, you would see these songs that hail the regime became echoed by the opposition forces using the same terms, but just changing their political attitudes, but using the same, mimicking the same songs and lyrics. And actually, this makes me use or draw on Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity, in which I suggest that these repetitions for 5 decades under authoritarianism, for 5 decades, we have been repeating these kind of, because it was a top-down ideology, the repetition of these masculines or nationalist valors became internalized. People perform gendered nationalism not because they are ordered to, but because these scripts have become deeply embedded in what Butler would call the citational chain of norms. As I wrote in chapter 6, Judith Butler, concepts of performance and performativity used here in analyzing how national belonging is manifested and reiterated even in the absence of a central authority. Actually, this is particularly evident in the national songs and videos that circulated during the war, many of which were produced not by the state, but by individuals or communities trying to affirm their sense of belonging, power, or loss. For example, videos of these songs were often made on phones or in small studios to repeat Baathist aesthetics, military uniforms, mourning for martyrs, romantic invocations of Syria as a mother or Syria as a lover. As I write, these new bottom-up articulations reveal how masculinism was not reconfigured and recalibrated by actors across the political spectrums, including rebels, loyalists, and but also those in exile. Now, the question is not just how does the regime sustain masculinist ideology, it's also why do so many men and communities choose to repeat it, especially when the regime is fractured or absent. This is where the emotional and gendered legacies of Baathist nationalism became most visible, not as a state propaganda, but as intimate, effective habits of the self. And here I'm talking about how after entrenched authoritarianism for 5 decades, how it intersects with masculinity. In the conclusion, I reflect on what it means to analyze nationalism not as a political project, but as a gendered, effective, and deeply embodied experience. As the book begins with state-led narratives, official histories, but it ends by looking at what happens when those narratives fractures, when the regime loses control over the very symbols and sentiments it once monopolized. It became more of a bottom-up approach, like authoritarian project is completed, and we have many different communities under the Baath regime, especially after the 2011, when they started to perform these very much Baathist ideals that they were forced to perform. And here it becomes that the emotional belonging to the nation very much synonymized with the self itself. Now, actually, what's really the conclusion also raises a central question: what would it mean to imagine a Syria beyond masculinism? While I don't pretend to offer a definitive answer, but I suggest that any attempt to reform legal, political, or cultural must confront the gender foundations of belonging. It must question who is allowed to represent the nation, whose sufferings count, and who is remembered in national memory. I think I close with a call to take seriously the work of being done by Syrian feminists and civic actors, many of whom are challenging these patriarchal norms, not through slogans, but through education, grassroots activism, and reimagining citizenship. In the end, this book is not just a critique of Baathist masculinity. Actually, it's an attempt to open space for other ways of imagining national belonging, ones that do not depend on heroic violence or patriarchal protections. And while these visions may be fragile or fragmented, they are, I believe, already in motion. And I don't know if I have the space to talk about masculinity in post-Assad Syria and reflect on my two, like my latest piece on this, or we can maybe talk through the questions. I don't know what would you prefer. I mean, when I submitted this book, when this book was published, and it was followed only in 2 weeks after the book was published 2 weeks before the regime fell down, and I felt like, and I visited Syria after 14 years of forced exile, and actually it gave me an immense, a moment of immense joy, but also reflection in a way of like the stages. Zaki al-Arsuzi, Saad al-Hasri, where I studied actually. These figures were really paramount in the Syrian culture. For example, I studied in a school called Saad al-Hasri, and also I moved to a school called Zaki al-Arsuzi, and their writings and their kind of concepts, their national concepts were very much like we lived it in our everyday experience. And then suddenly I went back to Syria, seeing that I don't see any statues, any representations of Baathist ideals that I used to feel that it suffocates me. But I saw a new order of masculinity emerging, even though like the first 3 days in Syria, I thought like, no, we don't have any masculinity projects anymore. And that's maybe because we have a different or complex form of new masculinity, a masculinity that does not hinge on personalistic or personality cult yet. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't see it in the future, but like for the time, Syrians have been traumatized for so long of worshipping one leader, and I think Ahmed al-Shara, I think he is very. He knows he is pragmatic. He knows that Syrians would not accept creating a personality cult of him now. So we don't have very different from what we had under the Ba'ath regime, where there is more of a worshipping of one leader. We see more of a masked masculinity. We see photos of pillars of banners where advertisements of the Ministry of the Interior Ministry, for example, or the Ministry of Defense, where they call men to join the security sector and to join the new Syrian army. You see photos not unlike the old photos that we see, the male body of Hafiz al-Assad or the soldier body of also depicted of certain soldiers. We see photos of men masked, not seen. We don't have even their back is shown to us, and it's very much like there is a more of a very homogenizing this form of masculinity, but also the mask is to inflict intimidation. And all, as my interviews with these central commanders from the opposition groups revealed to me, that they are doing this because they see that there is a difference between the old regime and the new regime, and they have fragile security institutions, and they were wondering how can we instill fear and intimidation into the new public, like we are now legitimizing ourselves into this new political order. So they thought like the mask will do the job. But also another thing is that there is really, because of the dissolvement of the old Baathist order, sectors, like in the dissolvement of many of the security sector, and the dissolvement of and the firing of thousands, hundreds of thousands of military of ex-regime officers. That means that the security institutions in Syria lacks the the number of enough security men, and so they needed that. They hinged on masculinity as a way to legitimize their or stabilize their order or prove themselves. I want also to cover, like, in this book, I didn't talk about all forms of masculinity. I talked about how the early national ideology that were enforced on Syrians by the state has continued to be manifested in the culture, in the legislative, and also in the culture and the legislative and context. Also, for example, there are many other forms of masculinity that emerged, such as the grievous masculinity, the revolutionary masculinity that I didn't talk about it in this book, but I'm talking. I have another publications on Syrian armed groups that talk about masculinity as actually the only theoretical framework that allowed me to group the drivers of these Syrian fighters together and say, like, this is what drove them to joining armed groups in 2012. So masculinity, even though that we have hundreds of various armed groups that emerged after 2011, I use in that project I used many theoretical framework, but then it got me, like, I have more than 100 hours of interviews with these fighters, and there is no one interview that missed the gender aspects, whether from interaction between me and the fighters, or even between, like, explaining what drove them to join the revolution and the armed conflict. Thank you so much. Sorry if I looked anxious, but, like, I just before the talk I lost my laptop and I was moving my my presentation to another laptop, so I felt like I don't know what I'm. But thank you.
No worries, no worries at all. Thank you, Rahaf. Actually, to build on what you just said, um, well, actually, I have quite a few questions. Maybe I should go with yeah, maybe I should go with the order, of the question that I had originally prepared. Um, and I tried to order them chronologically to parallel the progress of the argumentation of your book as per the chapters that you just shared with us. And one of the first thing I was intrigued with is at some point, quite early in the book, you tell us, that when it comes to it's in one of the start and actually, yeah, points of the book, you tell us that religion is not necessarily the arena that necessarily
Mhm.
subjectifies, right, women in Syria. Rather, it's thinking about nationalism,
Mhm.
um, but also this very masculinist way of doing, I would say,
Mhm.
right, imagining and doing nationalism. And I was wondering, when you tell us that it's not religion that subjectifies women, I was wondering who you are speaking back to or challenging here, in
Mm.
the sense that, like when we think historically about Syria, presumably a secular state, right?
Mm.
Um, I mean, the idea of
Yeah.
religion is not the first thing, right, that we associate.
And maybe that was, like, thank you so much, but that's why, because I received so many, like, from reviewers, the question of why you didn't choose religion. And I think whenever we talk about women in the Middle East, women's rights in the Middle East, we go immediately to this, I would say, these tools, framings that it's a tribe, it's sect, it's religion. But we don't talk about the ideology of the state. I think from my experience, and I don't want to say like it's my experience, but I believe, living in Syria and for most of my life, I have never religion. Authoritarianism is there. It's everywhere in the Middle East. I think I'm not generalizing, but I think, like, there's, yes, religion do have a great component. It becomes part of the state's project to legitimize itself. But I think in Syria in particular, expressing religious belief was not even allowed. So, for example, in my case, I saw the hijab or wearing a hijab as a tool to resist the regimes forcing nationalism or secular nationalism on me. I would never forget, for example, the experience. Not only me, my whole generation, my we experienced the same thing that girls who were veiled, they were hit at the doors of the school to remove their hijab, and it was made also when we were in the 11th grade, we had to go for 15 days and remove our hijab. So I didn't think back then that religion as a state, as nationalism imposed or a top-down ideology, religion did not even have a say. The regime did not allow the religion, that the religious institution to have a say there. So that's why I focused there. But also to balance my argument, yes, of course, communities tried to resist regime's authoritarianism by forcing a certain dress code on women and also certain ideals to differentiate between us and them. And of course, them was the Alawites, the state. That's how it was envisioned by the Syrian community. That it was there, but it was not legal. So we do have religious despotism in the private sphere, but when it comes to the institutionalized ideology used by the regime, it was more of a secular and not religious.
Yeah, and on this point, I think towards the end of the book, right, when you start talking about the decline, let's say, of the
Yeah.
Bashar regime, you tell us very clearly, right, how the religious
Yeah.
institution became
Yeah.
increasingly co-opted
Yes.
by the regime, right? All of a sudden, we have this religious secularism, like in
Kubaisiyat even. Yeah, yeah. I don't know
you
if I
see,
talked yeah, I don't know if I talked in this book or the other book. I'm writing
that's
two
fine.
other books. But I did
But
talk about, yes, al-Qubaisiyat, because Bashar
yeah,
al-Assad in later stages, he used women. He said he even talked to female ulama. He said, like, why we don't say al-alimat? I am here to tell you, like, I want this feminist approach. He did say, like, we have to start with this feminist approach, revitalize the religious institutions. And that's what makes me actually drove me to write this book on who owns Sunnism, sectism, because to me, I don't think Bashar al-Assad was not using religion. Just the other way around, he was striving to represent the Sunni community in order to prove himself legitimate. But of course, using sect as a card and instrumentalizing the Alawite sect.
yeah, absolutely. And again, to build on what you said, everybody should read. I think the whole first, the introduction, which is really more of it's a long reflexive, right,
Mm,
almost monologue that you engage in, and I think your attention to, your positionality, but also urging us, right,
mm.
anyone who engages in research to seriously seriously, right, where are
Where
situated
our
in
modes of
conflict
analysis
yeah,
coming
we
from?
come from, right? Yeah. What's the purpose of the research, right? Why do we conduct the research that we do? Why do we want to emphasize certain knowledges? So I absolutely love the introduction. I'll just, between parentheses, thank you, audience. Please keep posting your questions. I think we can come back to them. I love the question that's been posted here. I will come back to it because it does echo something that I prepared. This is maybe a little bit, I'm going to say,
Critical.
well, uh, uh,
I can criticize now my own self.
well, it's not really. I mean, it's more. I'm zooming a little bit out. I'm thinking, what do you think? Um, your book. What do you think, Middle East studies scholar?
Hmm.
Very mainstream authoritarianism
Yeah.
slash sectarianism, right? What do you think Middle East studies scholars are going to learn from your book, and what do you think gender, studies scholars are going to learn from the work? And
Yeah. You know, I actually, I kept asking myself these questions of why I focused on Sata al-Husari, Zaki al-Arsouzi, and Michel Afla, who no one believed actually that the Assad regime really kind of sidelined them and marginalized them, but they used their ideology. I think the importance of writings, early writings of ideologues, these writings, even, for example, now we are facing a new regime in Syria. Syria is in transition under new political order. It's important for me as a scholar, I think, to go back and trace who the new political order got influenced by, who do they read. And I think that's what my book is try to link gender to early writings, and not only within Arab or Middle Eastern context, but link it back to Western nationalism, because I always receive this question. I said, like, nationalism is a Western construct. Most of the nationalism that we have in the Middle East got borrowed from Herder, Fichte, and Renan. And these three scholars but they have patriarchal writings, they have very misogynistic views against women. And actually, in one of the chapters, I did see, like, when I say borrowings, sometimes there were plagiarism, and I did point it out in other articles, maybe not in the book, but in other articles, to prove these kind of the ideological borrowings. And actually, it's important because that when we nation, when they construct their narrative, they use certain concepts, and when we need to go back to these concepts, critique them, and trace their origins or their genealogy in order to build a new narrative and to go beyond the existing one.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, this made me think. So one of the speaker, right, about Middle East studies, for example, um, you tell us in the book, right, you make it clear that we have this canon, right, of
Mm.
this Baathist masculinity, whatever knowledge, and that hasn't been translated into English,
Mm.
and right, and it makes you like, and the first thought that came to my mind is, oh, who are these experts, right? Because all of a sudden, since 2011, since the uprising started in Syria, all of a sudden, everyone became expert,
And
right, on
experts,
Syria.
yeah.
And I was like, like who are they, right? It hasn't even been translated, but it wasn't that, right? It was even more so. It was so language, right, between
Mm.
Arabic English in relation to constructing knowledge, right, building knowledge. But also another interesting layer that you looked at is its intersection with class, right? And this differentiation between standard Arabic and the Ammiya.
Yeah, yeah,
So the
yeah.
standard Arabic, the classic, becomes associated with the elite, with the masculine, right? Whereas the
Yes.
Ammiya is seen as not good enough for building a respectable, progressive, etc. state. Yeah, I mean, I really like this part. So if you can elaborate more, I would
But can
appreciate
you
it.
remind, I mean, because I couldn't hear the first part of your question. So you are talking about the positionality and why I used not the Cambridge I don't know if you are no about the yeah.
The fact that this Baathist, the authors that you draw upon, so Arsuzi,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Asri, Aflak,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
their work hasn't been translated, and a lot of the things that
Yes, yes, no, nothing was. I had to go to the British Library in London to open the book and read the books of Sata al-Hasari, and I was not allowed to take any photos. I had to do so. Actually, because I spent long hours either taking my phone and trying to picture because I needed to draw these and to prove these borrowings. It was for me very challenging. No scholar, even my reviewers, they kept saying like, no, it's not there. But then I had to prove it through like these texts. And when Saad al-Hasari, even in one of his books, said, don't accuse me of borrowing from any thinker, because we are talking about an era of the 1920s. It was a new birth after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and Saad al-Husari did not know how to speak Arabic or learn. He doesn't know how to write Arabic. He started theorizing about like no, and he proved it himself by learning Arabic and writing 20 books to prove that we need to speak Arabic, as of course a challenge to the Ottoman Empire. And I think in that part, these thinkers, while they have not been really present in Syria, but their concepts continue to be used and utilized. And I think Syria is not an exceptional case, but it is. I think that there are so many parallels between Syria and Iraq. I do bet like Lebanon is completely, I think, completely different, and also Egypt as well. But we see that very much parallels between Syria and Iraq. And I wanted to say like the early writings of, for example, now when we talk about Ahmed al-Shara or the new or HTS and what's happening in Syria, I myself went back and to read Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, the early writings of the Jihadi Salafi, to see, because they are reading it. These new political actors that got influence from these ideologies. So it's important that we know what kind of concepts, even if these concepts became evolved or shifted, but still there are some origin to that, to that order, to that kind of concept.
So if we think about um, post, let's say, right, Baathist masculinist, yeah, post Baathist masculinity, and because I can't help but think a little bit about, the afterlife of the military.
Mm,
So, I mean, I'm from Lebanon. That's, the little bit what I've read about, right, a lot in the context of gender. And this idea, right, of like what happened to all these
mm,
militiamen, right, in the aftermath of the civil war. But also, it seems that the afterlives of the military is becoming, I mean, I don't want to say increasingly researched, right?
mm.
And at the same time, does it in a way reiterate, this notion of masculinity as something that's always in crisis, always failing,
Mm.
always, you know, unattainable.
We have a different, yeah, okay, yeah, I got it. Even me, when I embarked on this research, I started with militiamen in Lebanon, in the Lebanese civil war. And I do remember there are gorgeous Lebanese scholars, like they wrote really important pieces on this. Uh, I think in Syria we are shifting towards a totally new form of masculinities and gender power. We are moving from a personality cult to a complete Sunni entity, a rise of a sheikh, ulama kind of figure. There might be not very much popularized in our hailing or worshipping of him, and that's because of the trauma of personalizing the state with one leader. And I think all Syrians, regardless of their political kind of allegiance, they are fed up of seeing one leader like welcoming them when they enter the Syria. So you see, like, because we see, when we say their photos, we see the photos of these political leaders everywhere. Like if you like do that in this, you understand, you know that like from Lebanon as well. So I think we are moving to another form of masculinity. I think we have a grievous masculinity that I did not see before under the Ba'ath regime. A grievous masculinity that kind of become more depicted in my conversation or in my field work with Syrian armed groups. Men became more of the fighting became about reclaiming their agency. There is a sectarian of course, layers there, honor, I would say there is the greed, for example, because I depicted, I did interview Syrian fighters who fought in North Africa. They fighting beyond borders. They were recruited by Turkey to fight, and their masculinity there and patriarchy, and also very much manifested in their narratives. Because when I told them, like, you are now labeled in these in magazines as mercenary. And then his answers, most of their answers was, most of these fighters were like, people are seeing it as a greed, but I'm seeing it as a man who was displaced and lost his family, lost his mother. My mom, if I got killed, then if I died, then my family will get $60,000 in return. So the male power, the male kind of agency there, the kind of protection that we need to protect our families, manifested in their narratives, even when they are called mercenaries, that they fought beyond, they went to another country to fight. Also, I see another form of masculinity that is very pious, which I haven't seen in Syria before. In Syria, under the Baath regime, you would be scared to, as a sheikh or as an ulama, to prove your masculinity or to present yourself, because, and this is actually ironic and kind of sarcastically, when I was doing one of my interviews with the in the Ministry of Defense, with one of the commanders in the Ministry of Defense, and I said, like, oh, these masked men in the streets, they seem so cool. They seem so, like, they look nice. They look small in status compared to early Syrian Baathist, because we were used to, so Syrians would know if this police officer is an Alawite or no, or not. You would see that from their body type. They have certain features, and I was telling that to this central commander. So why these fighters are masked? And he said, like, some of these new recruiters in the Ministry of Defense and the Interior Ministry, they are young. They don't show a strong face. And that was even communicated to me. So in that way, so we see that in the new under the new political order, we see a new masculinity emerging, even if it's created. Even so, they want to create that and enforce that through the mask, by maybe hiding certain feminine features in one of these in some fighters. And because these fighters are, some of them, these new soldiers are young, they are not like, they have newly involved, got recruited under al-Sharia. Now, also, I think in Syria, we will see, as I said, a pious masculinity. You will see a fighter, a soldier, a minister, a political actor, a very that he prays and he is pious and he is reading the Quran. And I think that will resonate with the majority of Sunnis in Syria. And it's yet to be seen. It's yet to be seen how this interaction between now, because we see this masculinity at the state level. So you see ministers now reading the Quran before even starting any speech, or even before posting anything on social media. They will start with a certain in a certain way that prove their allegiance to Islam, and that they are Sunnis. All of this is about to be seen, how that will interact with the majority of Syrians, because the majorities are the majorities of, and I hate to say like majority and minority, but like the majority are have that kind of not Sufi kind of piety, I would say. They have that sense of belonging to a religious identity or to a Sunni identity, and that's understandable, because given the long years of war, 14 years of like very kind also state, like systematic sectarian violence against Syrians who were opposed to the regime, I think that would create a certain new order. And I think we would see in some cities, either we would see a full resistance to that kind of pious masculinity, or we will see more of a normalization of that and reproducing that from below.
Thank you, Rahaf. I am going to move to a couple of the questions that have been asked because they link directly to what you said. But also, I wanted to add on this point of sectarianism, right? Or sectarianization, let's say it, right? I think it would be more accurate. We see this new trend towards a renewed feminine, well, I don't want to say renewed. I'm not sure if it would even be theoretically accurate or or intellectually accurate to talk about a pre-existent feminism in Syria, but this idea that um, increasingly isolated bubbles, right,
Yeah,
created around so-called women's progress, feminism. So
yeah,
you tell us about Kurdish women's movement, Shia women
yeah,
movement, Sunni women
yeah.
movement, Islamic feminism, etc., etc. And yeah, just between parentheses, because I think it relates directly to what you just said. But to go back maybe one step before, and this is from an anonymous attendee. Maybe this links a little bit about this idea of militarized, the afterlife of violence, basically. And our attendee says, I believe that Syrians are now trying to come to terms with the extent and severity of state torture. And the question is, in what ways does this arguably, I'm going to guess they meant ritualized form of violence, i.e., the torture, inform the concepts of nationalism and masculinity? Um, you're muted, but don't worry about the technical.
No,
We
I
appreciate.
was trying to read the question. Um, yeah. So can you repeat it back again? Sorry, because I lost the voice from my.
No worries. So the question is really concerned about the scale of torture, state
Mm,
torture,
mm, mm.
and
Yeah,
it
definitely,
asks,
yes.
and
Yeah.
the question asks, in what way does this ritualized form of violence inform the concepts of nationalism and masculinity?
Well, definitely in post-Assad era, definitely, and even in the emergence of hundreds of armed groups. And that's exactly when I finished writing this book, and then it went in the long process of reproduction. I started with my research on armed groups. And although, like for me, I didn't want to work on masculinity, but then I couldn't, Sabiha, because it's everywhere. It's like when they were talking about torture, when they were talking about their time when they were arrested and detained, some of the fighters showed me their scars. For example, some they had a scar here, some they had a scar there, and these scars said like because of that they wouldn't let go fighting and they will keep fighting. And actually, this is worrying now because that now after the fall of Assad, so they are still have this kind of revolutionary identity and not as a citizen identity that you need to perform to the state because they feel like they are gonna continue fighting if anything not they don't agree with, which means that we are not in a stable kind of situation. So definitely torture, trauma, and even emotions, because I worked on emotions and armed groups and how the emotionality of the narratives of these commanders or fighters who even who joined fighting because they were subject to torture. So there is a new masculinity emerging. Some of that would be more of a sectarian one, avenging one, a grievous one, that they feel like they have the right, they are representative of the revolution, and this means that there is a binarism that's in the creation. If you say any word, you become accused of being a remnant or al-fulul. You became accused of not being national. You became accused of treason. So it's more dangerous. Before you have the regime and the opposition, but now you have uh, those who were at least working together for the last 14 years. The extent to which polarization within the Syrian communities now became more entrenched, and also masculinity become not only performative, but also when they want to shut you down, if you are speaking, or if you are writing, if you wrote an article, or even just expressing your political ideas. We see that we see the repetitions of the word of the statements like, we fought for this, we died for this, we were killed because of this, we were displaced because of this. I was told in the ministry, like I visited the Ministry of Education, and actually I was told by Naib Wazir Talim Ali, like, where were you? I thought, like, I was asked this in the Ministry of Education, of the higher education in Syria, coming to talk about a collaborative project, and he told me, now you come. Where were you for 14 years? And I said, like, I was writing articles against Assad. And he said, but we were being killed in Idlib. And I said, like, I'm sorry, that's everything that I can do, unless you want me that to prove my national identity and belonging to you, that I need to fight. Unless it's fighting the only, like I myself got into this situation or that kind of conversation less than 2 months ago. So we see these new forms of masculinities emerging under the new political order.
Yes, thank you, Rahaf. I think we have there's a mini question. I'm not. I think let's ask it. Um, you. So the question says, you called the violence over the past 14 years sectarian violence,
Mm.
and I think it's by an anonymous attendee, and I think the attendee disagrees with the phrasing of sectarian violence. And do you believe that the state violence done by a regime composed of
Uh-huh.
tyrants from all sects against the Syrian people
Yeah, yeah,
was sectarian?
yeah.
And yeah,
No,
they want some
yeah,
clarification.
I don't use sectarianism in a sweeping way. Um, I don't think, I think the regime would have used violence against any sect if it threatened them. And I don't call Alawite violence or Sunni violence. I believe that there has been an entrenched authoritarianism for 5 decades that would have killed anyone in Syria would oppose them, even if you were Alawites. But okay, that's said, the regime used Alawites. And actually, in my latest research on Alawites, I published a report on Alawites' political attitude just 5 months before the fall of the regime. And they showed lots of their political attitudes, that they are also the report showed. I used 150 survey collected within in regime controlled areas in Al Sahel, in coastal areas. I don't think that sectarianism is that we have sectarian tension before, but of course, in the mid of ongoing conflict, you see that sectarian tension or violence takes many shapes. Sometimes patriarchal, sometimes they would use sect, sometimes tribal, sometimes ethnic, and it's happening ethnic. We are not here talking about there is ethnic violence between Arabs and Kurds in northern Syria. So I wouldn't call it like just sectarian violence as Alawites versus Sunnis. just the opposite. Actually, my new book is about Sunni divide, because I don't believe that the Syrian conflict should be framed as a Sunni versus Alawite. It's Syrians against authoritarianism. This is how we were. But authoritarianism, of course, uses many tools and many cards here and there. They will use women, they will use sect, they will use Alawites, they will use Sunnis. Let's not forget Kuftaro. Many of the Sunni leaders, they were all Sunnis. We have many Sunnis in the elite structure of the state under the Baath regime. So it was not like only they used everyone. So that's my understanding of the sectarian violence when it's used.
Yeah, definitely right. And when we think about sectarian tension, violence, and sectarianization of Syria, I mean, when we think about it through a gender lens, right? Every community is going to have its us versus them, our women,
Yeah,
your women, our
yeah.
men, your men. And this is classic, gender analysis of women being representative of their culture, etc. And I lost a little bit here. Yeah, my Hilda. I'll come back to it. I had a nice question for you, but maybe we can carry on. We have a question from Nicola Pratt, um, and Nicola asked about examples of Syrians resisting or subverting Baathist masculinity. Uh,
Mm.
asks her, and she said she's very excited to read your book,
Oh, thank
and
you.
many congratulations. And
Ah,
so, in addition to asking whether you came across any examples of Syrians resisting Baathist masculinity, have you identified possibilities
mm.
for resisting, subverting Baathist masculinity?
Okay. Mm.
And if I
Yeah,
may add,
yeah.
so I think this is an important question, but because I also like the many future trajectories, for
Mm.
research
Mm.
that you also include in the book, and perhaps we can place these in conversation with each others.
Mm.
Um, if you
Yeah,
think,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. No, I think, thank you so much, Nicola, for this question. And I think one of my I while writing this book, I always come across resisting or subverting, but I couldn't include it in this book. That's why I'm taking it to my project on armed groups. But I think yes, definitely. For example, in the songs that were there were Baathist songs, and we see the opposition created the same songs with different lyrics. So they used the same Baathist songs to express their resistance of the regime. That's in a cultural way, that's how they I think I saw moods of resisting regimes ideals of masculinity other than movements we saw during the war in from 2011. We saw the emergence of many feminist movements. However, the core feminist movements called الحركة السياسية النسوية السورية, it's still in its infancy, and there is matriarchy there. So, in a way, I feel like still these new movements mirrors, in a way, the same hierarchical orders that we see in the Baathist institutions. And I think that's why some of my research in the last 2 years has focused on political culture, because it struck me when you see that so many, even when I was analyzing the songs of under like before the Syrian uprising, I was listening to these songs, Sabiha, and I felt like, although I do remember very well that when I was a child, as an act of resistance, I was not even singing. I wouldn't sing. But then when I was here in the UK and my country there, and when I was listening, I felt a certain national pride. And that's why I came back now, like 2 years ago, I started to ask, to collect surveys on pride, dignity, and what does it mean? Because even after 2011, you see the influence or the impact of these songs on your understanding of national belonging and identity. And you see that these songs became echoed in opposition groups. So you see that this is part of the interactions between resistance and control or hegemony, I think. So in every day you would see acts of resisting, such as I said, not singing, not hailing in the morning what the state would force the schools to say. That's all kind of little forms, or acting as if, quoting Wedin, on as if they are submissive to the regime, but they are resisting.
Yeah, thank you, Rahaf. And talking about resisting, but also thinking about your attention to recognizing shared struggles, right? Somewhere towards the end of your book.
Yeah,
So, as for example, I'm from the city of Tripoli in Lebanon, and usually the events in Syria are going to immediately impact, right, Tripoli and
yeah,
Akkar. And I think, like, thinking about subverting, I would say it's important to be really aware and speak against the demonization, right,
mm.
of I, the Alawite sect per
Yeah,
se.
definitely.
As soon as the regime fell, there were all these conspiracies, right,
Yeah,
circulating online about the Assad family. Not only are they Alawite,
yeah,
are they're Kurds,
yeah.
they're
They
Jews,
are
right?
Israelis, they are
They are
Jews, they are
Israeli,
like
so
always hear this
layers and
story. Yeah,
layers, right?
yeah,
Layers and layers of very problematic, decontextualized, clearly co-opted, instrumentalized, weaponized, right? Conspiracies in line with all the information, misinformation processes that usually happen around the world. And maybe this is a question. I mean, so for me, reading the book, one thing that I liked, I would say, was it's very clear, right? Its framework is very clear. This is about national Baathism, masculinity in Syria, contemporary Syria, I would say modern Syria. Um, and I'm not sure to what extent, you know,
yeah,
I mean, let me ask the question and then we can see, right? Because sometimes I feel that sometimes it was too much Syria. Like
yeah,
I wanted to see a little bit of, because there was a Baathist party, okay, different
yeah, yeah,
in Iraq, right? There
yeah,
was at some point
yeah,
pan Arab, very, very
yeah,
short-lived,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
United Republic, etc.
yeah,
But regardless of this, and maybe these links weren't, or
yeah,
historical events weren't necessarily highlighted because, you know,
yeah.
there was an urgency, right, to make your argument
Yes,
very
yeah,
clear.
yeah, yeah,
But also, I wanted to thinking about this really. At some point, you use aggressive in your book, masculinity. This very Baathist nationalist. Um, I, I was thinking, where
yeah,
does it sit along other global trends
yeah,
about these renewed nationalist? I mean, maybe they are historically not in the same plane, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
Are you making like why I didn't make comparisons with other contexts in the Arab world? Is that your questions, or why I did not? Because I thought like the urgency of Baathism as a Baathism. Because if you this book I started with like 10 years ago in 2000. Yeah, 7 years ago, like I started like when I got the contract. But like when that time, if you write Syrian nationalism, you would see, for example, very little. Even they wouldn't say Al-Wataniyya Suriye. So I thought like my part as a Syrian academic is to introduce this term, because when I embarked on this research, even Syrians who are like were much senior than me, they said like we don't have a Syrian nationalism. It's non-existent. we have Arab nationalism, we have Baathism. So I thought my task is to say no. And I think this incongruence, this identity crisis that we have, this is legitimacy crisis, is because forever the regime create the regime started to say since the rise of Hafez al-Assad in the 1970s that we are Arab Syrians in the the Arabs in the Syrian Arab Republic. This is in the constitution. We see even in Syrian laws, you see Arabs in the Syrian Arab Republic. So there is no Syrian citizens. We don't hear Syrians. We see Arabs in Syria. This is for the this is first, this is undermining, marginalizing many other ethnicities in Syria. This is about also manifest as constructing a certain national ideology that the states want. And then we see the shift in the 1990s towards not Syrianism, but the rise of Hafez al-Assad as the leader, the personality cult. And I see like, no, but there are some instances, but all of these trajectories from the 1920s and the rise of Baathism and then the rise of Assadism, and then we have 2011, all of this I would term Syrian nationalism. And I wanted actually that my book to say that there is a Syrian nationalism, because in all other or previous scholarship, none has said like there is a nationalism in Syria. It's always been linked to Arabism or to Arab nationalism. And I think definitely in 60 years, the regime or the state or this interaction between the top and the down, definitely we created a certain type of nationalism, and I want to talk about it. So I think that it was my positionality, the urgency of the matter, and that's why actually made me write an article, What is Syrian Nationalism, Primordialism and Romanticism? And I think that was my contribution. I felt so confident that I'm coming with this term, because before, even the most respectable scholars who wrote about Syria and ideology, they didn't term it as Syrian nationalism. There is Zisser, and I don't want to like. There is a scholar, Zisser. He did talk about Syrian nationalism, but not in that frank manner. And I came in 2013, I started to use the term, and I said like, and that, okay, no, this term does exist. And I'm trying to say that it goes back to Saad al-Husari and also to European Romanticism. And I'm trying to document the genealogy of the Syrian nationalism, because before it wasn't. So that what helped me, because I wanted to prove that there is a Syrian nationalism that is existing, that actually limited the scope of the book and limited my ability to compare with other contexts. But this is what I did when I like took some of the topics and published in journal articles. I was drawing on other comparisons.
Absolutely right. And to be able to theorize, right, Syrian nationalism, I think, and you tell us and you convince us in the book, could have only been done through inhabiting a very specific positionality, right? And yeah, I mean, I'm convinced, and obviously, I want to recommend everyone to read the book. And I think it's a really sharp book in the sense that it's a tooth, fine tooth comb, right? Analysis, gender analysis, almost the insidious ways, right, in which gender infiltrate, right, every aspect of the social fabric, the legal institutions, etc., like ways that wouldn't be apparent, right, immediately, neither to the naked eye nor to the, mainstream conventional, theorist analyst. Um,
Thank you.
I think we can take one more question. There is a question here, I quite like it, from Abdullah Al-Diriyai. Um, I'll just go quick to the question. It's a whole paragraph, and congratulating you also on your book.
Thank you.
And the question is, how do you perceive the connection between democracy in the Middle East and the rise of military muscularity among soldiers who abuse their, authority? And yeah, and
Yeah, I
if
got
I,
the
if
question because that's the million, the million question. Yeah.
yeah, but can I think we can also link it right to the because to the I would say phenomena around the Middle East, right? It's
Yes,
not
definitely.
only the rise of
Syria is not exceptional. Yeah, yeah.
Heda, but the increased inclusion of women, right, in the military realm all across the Middle East. Like they're not in the administrative works anymore, right? So Lebanon has a very similar
Yeah.
novelties. We have women combatants, women joining the actual, police forces. A whole campaign by the media and the state nexus, right, to make this visible, right?
This brings me, yeah, yeah, to some of the
And
American
is this
feminism.
democratic? Is this feminist? Is this progressive? So I think we
That's why
definitely
I
have.
didn't use feminism in my book actually, because that's exactly. Thanks for that. Thanks for bringing me that because I was actually while writing this book, also I got like influenced by certain interactions with American feminists in my one of my fellowships to the US, and I felt like if feminism is if feminism has evolved now into like creating this equality by putting more women into this military barracks that we know as institutions in the Middle East. They are tools of tortures and tools of then what we are achieving. And I think I don't know if I see it that way, but and I have my own conception of democracy, and I don't believe that we will transit to democracy even with the fall of authoritarian regimes. We need political culture, we need time, we need practice. Um, you need to create to construct also a very robust security institutions that is institutionalized, not only like security by using force or dominating the land يعني انه محتل الارض, like no, we need something that is that helps to accountability and also building trust with the people. I I don't want to sound depressing. Please excuse that I'm following the Syrian news on and by every minute. I'm not hopeful about democracy in the next 5 years or 10 years. I am hopeful. I am hopeful that we won't see any more killings in Syria. But I don't think, from what I'm seeing, 5 decades of authoritarianism, also the rise, full victory of a rebel group such as HTS, definitely we wouldn't be transitioning to democracy. They have their own challenges, even if Ahmed al-Shara was genuine about democracy, he still is facing his challenges with his own base, who are mostly jihadists, foreigners, and they are believing in Salafi jihadi ideology, even if he renounced that. So we have there that fear, and we have also what is difficult that we see a transformation from maybe an Alawite based or sect-based violence or sect-based state. Now we see again more of a sect-based re-emergence of Sunnism. And I think Ahmad al-Shura is the first one who said, like, we want to create Al-Kayan al-Sunni. And that was 2 years ago. So, and we see that emerging now. And I think that will be used as a mobilization force to garner more legitimacy, to even solidify their authority and stability. So that kind of religion will be used, and also that what's I think democracy. I don't think that even if we wrote the best constitution ever, if there is no political culture, that where people believe to abide by this, I think we are still very long. There's a long road before achieving this. I don't
And
want to
the
sound
fact,
depressing.
no, I mean, but also the fact that, I mean, or the question of what is democracy
Yeah,
anyway? I mean, is the US right now a democratic
yeah,
country? I beg
yeah,
to differ, so, and maybe in continuation, right, of sometimes thinking critically and beyond, this European imposed knowledges that we are given and we build upon sometimes uncritically just because, it's European and we presume that's the way to go with it. Maybe it's also time to interrogate, such concept as,
yeah,
democracy. What is democracy according to who, for whom, et cetera, et
yeah.
cetera. And so, yeah, I think, wow, I mean, we did fill the 90 minutes. I did expected, yeah, to take this long. I want to thank you, Rahaf, again
Thank you,
for
Sabiha. Thanks,
through this.
thank you, and thanks everyone for attending.
I still have lots of questions. I think we can have additional ones.
Hopefully.
And thank you, our audience. Thank you for participating, for showing up. And as ever, I want to thank Rosa Sansone, who's our BRISMES manager, who took care of, coordinating, advertising the event. And yeah, on behalf of everyone in BRISMES, thank you. Have a
Thank you.
wonderful afternoon. Take care, everyone.
You too, Sabiha. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.